Boost gang! Hey, today I'm going over the fuel system in my LSA swap in this 71 Nova. So let me provide a quick overview of the fuel system starting at the engine and going back from there. Pretty simple, 4 major components. That is fuel injectors, fuel rail, the lines and accessories, and then fuel pump and obviously the fuel tank. So for the fuel rail, you've got a few options with an LSA swap. First up, you can use the ZL1 or LSA fuel rail, which has an inlet on the passenger side. Now another option is an LS9 fuel rail. This has the inlet on the driver's side. Now this actually worked for me because I already had an inlet on the driver's side from my LS3 fuel rail. So swapping over from the LS3 to the LS9 was natural for me. Now both those options are about $200 give or take. Now another aftermarket option are Radium Engineering. They have fuel rails that'll work with the LSA. That's about $430. Naturally it looks better, but I'm not particularly interested in looks as long as I got speed. So that's something that you can look at as well. So fuel injectors are very important. You need injectors that are properly sized for your horsepower goals and probably a little bit bigger than what you need for your horsepower goals. So I went online, I used a fuel injector calculator, threw in 700 horsepower or so, and figured on some injectors based on an 85% duty cycle. Typically people will use around 80%, 80 to 90%. I felt confident using an 85% duty cycle for my calculations. Now, if you're running E85, you're naturally going to need to bump things up. A lot of the calculators will actually show you, if you put in a given injector flow, they will show you what the horsepower level is that those will support based on fuel pressure and fuel type used. So I ended up with fuel injector connections 750cc injectors. Now these are rated at 43.5 psi. My idle fuel rate, or off boost fuel rate if you would, is set at 43, so that's about perfect. Now those I calculated at an 85% duty cycle will support close to 900 horsepower at the flywheel. So I have plenty of room to grow if I want to and when I want to increase my horsepower even more. So when you're looking for injectors, you want to look at a couple of things. Now the LSA actually uses what's called a US car or EV6 style electrical connector. That's common with the LS3 and also with the LS2, I believe. Now, LS2s I think are different in actual sizing versus the LSAs. So if you have an LS2 and you want to put a supercharger on it, an LSA supercharger, you're probably not going to be able to reuse those injectors, even if they are, say, 850s or something like that. So make sure that your injectors actually work for the LSA. It's not very difficult to get online, go to an injector company and say LSA injectors. They'll pop right up and show you what you need. Now the LQ4 shares what's called an EV1 electrical connector with the LS1 and some other LS engines. Naturally, if you're coming from that, you're going to want to get an adapter or even splice in your own connectors to fit those LSA style injectors. I actually had an LS3 top end already on this thing, so I had already swapped them over as it was. I didn't use adapters. I actually went through when I did my wiring and physically changed out the connector. So here's that fuel rail. You can see that there is, behind here, we've got a bit of a soft line right there. I actually had to bend this up slightly to work with my tensioner bracket. So that wasn't such a big deal, but I just kind of bent it right up here. Just be careful if you have to bend anything. I also found that on my particular application, I had to drill out, I think it was that hole right there. And I also had to kind of pick this up. You can kind of see right here, this is a bracket for the bleed valve, and that was contacting that little cast bracket. So I had to kind of, I think, re-drill, like I said, that mounting point right there so that I could fit that without it rubbing or chafing or anything like that. So moving over, you see the other side there, kind of behind some electrical connectors and what have you. So here is a Russell adapter fitting. You see I've got 6A in line, and I have this Russell adapter fitting that goes from the 3/8 GM Quick Connect to 6AN. It's part number 644133. Now, this has a metal thread-on insert to connect to this fuel rail. Earlier designs had a little plastic clip in here instead. And what would happen was that plastic clip would become brittle and it would break off, and that would push the fuel line out. Fuel pump would still be going, it'd splash fuel all over your engine. It's bad news. So this soft line goes down to my frame, and then I have a hard line along my frame all the way to the back, where I've got more soft line connecting to the tank and another one of these fittings connected to my fuel pump. All right, now you might be thinking, so what about the fuel pump? Great question. So when I first did the swap in the Nova, I used an Aeromotive Stealth 340 pump with the Corvette filter regulator. Now this is the typical setup for LS and fuel injected swaps in general, which require an external regulator and filter between the fuel pump and rails. But I run into issues common with this so-called pump on a stick design, namely fuel starvation in turns and at low fuel levels. I also had an issue with my pump cutting out when hot. Aeromotive actually told me that the Corvette regulator is known to deadhead the pump at higher fuel flow requirements, which eventually destroys it. So right about that time, I found a tech write-up by a guy on LS1 Tech. His name is Guy 2006. And what he did was he retrofitted a 5th gen Camaro pump into his 1st gen Camaro. Now, this was very intriguing to me. The benefits of the 5th gen pump are well, from the factory, first and foremost, it's PWM controlled, pulse width modulation, which means that the PCM or fuel pump controller actually sends a modulated signal. So it's, instead of just being full on voltage to the pump, on or off, it actually acts like a switch. And so it sends full voltage, no voltage, full voltage, no voltage. And that effectively throttles the pump at idle and low fuel requirements. It is off just as much, if not more so, than it is on, that switch signal, that PWM signal. At higher fuel flow levels, it actually expands that signal so that when it's on for a little bit longer, shuts off for a briefer period, to the point where eventually it either reaches full voltage, which is just full tilt for that thing, 100% wide open throttle if you would, or it gets very close to it. So it effectively reduces the fuel pump output by throttling it as opposed to just running it all on or all off. This has a few benefits. First and foremost, you don't have to run an external regulator, which is wonderful. You don't have to run a return line. You can just run one line all the way up to the front of the car. In addition, the pump is quieter and it requires less power to run, which is a very good thing. So it's much more efficient to run a PWM style than it is to run just at full tilt and have a regulator that sends unused fuel back to the tank. So in addition, this pump is part of an assembly. The nice thing about that is the pump itself is inside a tray. That tray ensures that it's got fuel around it at all times, so it's not starving for fuel. So your tank doesn't need to have baffles, doesn't have to have any sort of windage or anything like that in there, because the pump itself comes as a full-on loaded unit. That tray has little jets on the underside that help kind of pull fuel into the tray to ensure that you've got a quart or so of fuel surrounding that pump at all times. Now, if you wanted to run NA, which actually is what I did for a while with this 5th gen pump, there's a company out there called Vaporworks, VAPORWORX. Give Carl at Vaporworks a call. They sell a kit to modify the 5th gen Camaro pump with a 4th gen mechanical regulator. What that does is that allows you to run this 5th gen pump in your tank, and you don't have to get an external PWM controller. So it does run it at full tilt. It is rather loud. I wouldn't say much louder than an aftermarket pump at all, but compared to the PWM that I've got in here now, it is much louder. I noticed that after I went PWM, the sound level came down significantly. But you get this kit, it's about $100 plus the cost of the pump, and you have one line that goes to the front. So you don't have to worry about running, like I said, an external regulator, 2 lines, one for pressure, one for return, just one single line all the way to the front. Now, one thing that you have to realize with this is it's not as simple as just dropping it in. If you've got a pump on a stick, it does require a different hat it does require a different installation style or whatever. The pump's much bigger, the assembly is a bit bigger than what your pump on a stick design is. So what I did was, because my pump had been used and had already been modified for a pump on a stick, which had a little recessed tray at the top for clearance, I actually took some shears and cut that opening out a little bit bigger so that I could fit that pump in. I then went to the junkyard and found a late model tank. I cut that ring out, the install ring, and I was able to bolt that install ring with a gasket on top of the tank. Another great thing about it is that it's got variable height. It can accept tanks of different heights. So it's actually spring loaded. The top of it and the bottom of it are spring loaded. So for example, if you've got an early Nova or a Camaro, it actually drops in almost perfectly. So if you're stepping up to, say, a supercharger, you can look into the Camaro ZL1 and the CTSv fuel pumps. So both of these pumps cannot be mechanically regulated. They're both PWM controlled only. Vaporworks sell a kit for both of those pumps. If you have a ZL1 pump like I do, they have a kit for that. And if you have a CTSv pump, they also sell a kit for that. Now, the ZL1 pump is good to approximately 600 horsepower supercharged, and the CTSv is good to approximately 800 horsepower supercharged. Now, I've already installed everything, and I do love you, but not enough to drop that tank and show you the pump. That said, we can still go to the back. I can show you the controller and some of the wiring for it. Let's go check it out. So here we have the Vaporworks PWM fuel pump controller. This one is specific for my ZL1 pump. So essentially what this controller does is it takes the signal from the PCM for fuel pump control. It then outputs a PWM signal to the fuel pump. Now it's got a feedback loop in the form of fuel pressure and also manifold pressure. So it uses the 3-bar map sensor, and it also uses a fuel pressure sensor as well, both of those as feedback. So connecting this thing up is fairly straightforward. We have a few different wires. There's battery positive, which just goes straight to the battery. Comes with its own fuse up there, you can't see it. This is pump output right here. There are common negatives, battery, I think the PWM signal, and then the pump negative as well. Now there are several connections here. There's the map sensor, which goes all the way up to the 3-bar map. And then there's also the fuel pressure sensor, which again tells this controller how much fuel pressure. Now the cool thing with this PWM controller is this will actually run on 58 psi constant if you don't hook up the map sensor. So before I had the supercharger, I installed the ZL1 pump, and then I installed this controller. I ran all the wires up. I ran the wires up front, didn't connect them to my map sensor. And so I was able to run this for a while at 58 psi constant when I was running NA. And then when I installed the supercharger, I tapped into that 3-bar map sensor and got that feedback loop. Now the Vaporworks controller is about 500 bucks. The ZL1 pump's another 200, with the CTSv being a bit more than that. Vaporworks also sell the lock ring and tray if you can't find a donor like I did. And worst case scenario, you can go to Rick's Tanks. For about 500 bucks, they've got a tank you can drop one of these pumps into. Now this isn't cheap by any means. You just can't beat the quality and reliability of OEM proven hardware and control scheme. And even if you aren't running a supercharger, the 5th gen Camaro pump with Vaporworks internal regulator still offers one-line convenience and supports up to 600 horsepower. Plus, the CTSv and ZL1 pumps will drop right in once you feel the need for boost. I mean, it's a no-brainer. Anyway, that's all I've got for today. I'll catch you on the next video.